Nobody believed me the first time I said it out loud. I was standing in a gas station parking lot somewhere in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights hum just loud enough to be unsettling, and the wind comes across the flat land with nothing to slow it down. The guy next to me was fueling up a newer truck, one of those enormous pickups with the chrome package and the factory stickers still visible if you knew where to look. He asked how old my car was the way people sometimes ask just to make conversation, not really expecting an answer that would stop them cold. I told him. And then I showed him the odometer, reading I had written on a folded piece of paper in my wallet, because I always carried it with me, always. The running total, updated every time I pulled out of a service station after a fill-up. He went quiet. He looked at the car. Then he looked at me. Then back at the car. And he said slowly, like the words themselves didn't quite fit in his mouth, "That's not possible." I just smiled because I had heard that before. I had known for a very long time that what I had done was something most people believed belonged in the category of the impossible. But I also knew that the impossible in this case had a very specific and learnable explanation. And tonight, I am going to give you every single piece of it. 900,000 miles. Let that number sit with you for a moment before we go any further. 900,000 miles on one car, one engine, one transmission, no catastrophic mechanical failure, no emergency rebuild, no phone call to a tow truck in the middle of the night because something underneath finally gave way. Just miles. Long, deliberate, carefully accumulated miles, built one careful decision at a time over more years than most people keep any car at all. When people hear that number, they tend to immediately look for the exception, the loophole, the asterisk, the hidden explanation that makes it less impressive than it sounds. Was it a diesel? Was it a fleet vehicle? Was it driven mostly on flat highway with no cargo? And my answer to all of those questions is, it doesn't matter nearly as much as what I did every single day, because what I did every single day is what anyone can do. What I did every single day is what almost no one actually does. And the gap between those two things is 900,000 miles. I want to be clear about something before we go any further, because I think it matters to understand who I am and who I am not. I am not a mechanic. I have never been a mechanic. I didn't grow up in a garage, didn't have a father or an uncle who rebuilt engines on weekends, didn't go to technical school or earn a certification in automotive repair. I was an ordinary person with a car, and what separated me from every other ordinary person with a car was not skill, not wealth, not special access to information that other people couldn't find. What separated me was a decision, a single, foundational decision made very early in the life of that car. To pay attention, to be deliberate, to treat the machine not as an appliance that I expected to simply work until it didn't, but as a living mechanical system that had needs, that communicated those needs if you learned to listen, and that would reward genuine care with a longevity that the automotive industry has spent decades telling you is unrealistic. It is not unrealistic. It is what I did, and here is how I did it. Habit number 1. The first habit changed everything, and it is the one that I believe does more cumulative damage when ignored than almost any other single behavior behind the wheel. It sounds simple. It is simple. But the fact that it sounds simple is exactly why most people hear it, nod, and then immediately go back to ignoring it every single morning when they start their car. The first habit is this. I never, not once in 900,000 miles, drove a cold engine hard. Think carefully about what is happening inside your engine in the first minutes after a cold start. The oil, your engine's lifeblood, is sitting in the oil pan thick and slow because oil viscosity increases as temperature decreases. Even with a quality synthetic that flows well in cold conditions, the oil takes time, real, measurable time, to fully circulate through every oil passage, every bearing journal, every critical surface inside that engine. During those first minutes, parts are operating with slightly wider tolerances than they will once the metal has reached operating temperature. The seals haven't fully seated. The combustion chamber geometry is not yet where it will be at full operating temperature. And if you hammer the throttle in those first few minutes, if you merge onto the highway at wide open throttle, if you rev the engine hard to make a light, if you leave your driveway like you're launching off a starting line, you are driving metal against metal with inadequate lubrication and incorrect mechanical tolerances. The damage from any single instance of this is invisible to you. You will never see it. You will never be able to isolate it, point to it, and say that was the moment that cost me 50,000 miles of engine life. But it is there. And repeated day after day, cold start after cold start, it accumulates into a pattern of accelerated wear that condemns engines to early failure long before their metallurgy or engineering should allow. I understood this. And so for the first several miles of every single drive, I drove gently. I let the oil circulate. I let the temperatures rise toward normal. I watched the temperature gauge, and I will talk about gauges in a moment because that subject deserves its own chapter. And I did not push that engine until it was genuinely ready to be pushed. This cost me nothing in real terms. Those first gentle miles were almost always the beginning of a trip anyway. But what it returned in kind was an engine that reached operating temperature in normal condition every time, never subjected to the specific and particular punishment of hard use on cold metal. Over the full 900,000 miles, the number of cold starts I gave the engine time to recover from before demanding performance is in the tens of thousands. Every single one of them was a small deposit into an account that paid out in longevity. Habit number 2. The second habit is one that the modern world has done an extraordinary job of destroying. And I say that without exaggeration. The modern world has made silence uncomfortable. We fill our cars with music, with podcasts, with phone calls on speaker, with the aggressive bass of audio systems that cost more than the tires. And in doing so, we have cut ourselves off from the most important source of real-time diagnostic information available to any driver: the sounds the car makes when it is operating normally, and the sounds it makes when it is trying to tell you that something is beginning to go wrong. The second habit is listening. Not casually, deliberately. Every drive with genuine attention to the acoustic signature of the vehicle underneath you. Your car is always communicating. It is a system of extraordinary mechanical complexity, thousands of parts operating in coordinated motion. And when any part of that system begins to deviate from its designed parameters, it almost always announces that deviation acoustically before the deviation becomes a failure. A faint knock at idle that wasn't there last week. A subtle harmonic vibration that appears only at certain highway speeds. A change in the pitch of the exhaust note that you couldn't quite explain, but that sounds different than it did before. A squeal from the brakes that is just barely audible when you stop gently at low speed. A clicking from the front suspension that only appears when you turn left. These are whispers. These are warnings being sent to you by a mechanical system that is working as hard as it can to survive. And most drivers never hear them, not because they are incapable of hearing them, but because they are not listening. I learned the sound of my car the way you learn the sounds of a house you have lived in for many years. intuitively, deeply, so thoroughly that any deviation from the established pattern registers immediately, not as something you can immediately name, but as something that feels wrong before you can explain why. Every time something sounded different, I paid attention to it. I didn't turn the radio up. I turned it down or off. I tried to isolate whether the sound appeared at certain speeds, at certain temperatures, on certain road surfaces, when the engine was under load or at idle, when turning or going straight. And every single time I caught a problem at the whisper stage. The repair was minor. A belt, a hose, a small seal, a wheel bearing just beginning to complain before it progressed to the grinding stage. Not once in 900,000 miles did a small sound that I noticed at the beginning become the kind of catastrophic failure that only happens when small sounds are ignored until they can no longer be heard over the larger, more terrible sounds of something breaking. Habit number 3, the third habit, is the one that every mechanic in America wishes more of their customers would actually follow. Not because it generates business, but because the consequences of ignoring it are so consistent and so avoidable that the people who work on cars for a living find it genuinely painful to watch. The third habit is oil changes, not just getting them done, but getting them done correctly, on time, with the right product, with full attention to interval and specification. And never, under any circumstances, stretching the interval because of cost or convenience. Here is what I need you to understand about engine oil and what it does over time. It lubricates. Yes, that is the obvious function, the one everyone knows. But it also cools internal engine components that have no other cooling mechanism. It cleans, carrying combustion byproducts and metallic particles away from surfaces in suspension. It protects against corrosion. It provides a hydrodynamic film that prevents metal-to-metal contact in bearings and journals. It does all of these things simultaneously, and it does them well when it is fresh, properly formulated, and at the correct level. Over time, the base oil breaks down under the thermal and mechanical stress of engine operation. The additive package, the detergents, the anti-wear compounds, the viscosity modifiers, the anti-corrosion agents, gets consumed. The oil becomes contaminated with byproducts of combustion, with water from condensation, with microscopic metallic particles that are a normal result of the very wear the oil is trying to prevent. When oil reaches this state and is not changed, it does not simply stop being effective. It begins to actively work against the engine it was meant to protect. Old, degraded, contaminated oil forms sludge. Sludge deposits block oil passages. Blocked oil passages mean components running with insufficient lubrication. Components running without sufficient lubrication fail, and they fail in ways that are rarely reversible. I changed my oil on schedule, always, without exception. I used oil that met or exceeded the manufacturer's specifications. I verified the level between changes and topped it off when needed, because even a well-maintained engine can consume oil, and running low is as damaging as running dirty. And every time I drained the old oil into a drain pan, I looked at it. I looked at the color. Black oil is normal. Milky oil means coolant contamination and indicates a gasket or seal problem that needs immediate attention. Gray oil can indicate similar issues. I looked at the consistency. I looked for the glitter of metallic particles that might indicate unusual internal wear. The oil told me things every single time. And because I was paying attention, those things were never surprises. Habit number 4. The fourth habit is the kind of thing that makes sophisticated people roll their eyes when they first hear it, because it sounds too simple, too grandmotherly, too obvious to be a legitimate piece of advice. But I kept it anyway, consistently for 900,000 miles, and the component it protected never once failed on me. The fourth habit is never letting the gas tank go below a quarter. Not as a rough guideline. As a rule I followed so consistently it became a physical reflex. The fuel pump in most modern fuel-injected vehicles lives inside the fuel tank, submerged in gasoline. This is not an accident. The gasoline itself serves as a coolant for the pump motor. When you routinely run the tank down to nearly empty, the pump is no longer submerged. It operates in a hot, poorly cooled condition. It works harder to pull fuel from a nearly depleted tank. The thermal stress on the motor accelerates wear on the components inside it. Do this once. Nothing happens that you'll notice. Do it 100 times. And drivers who routinely run to the warning light do it 100 times easily. And you're looking at a fuel pump that has been running hot and hard for thousands of miles more than it needed to. Fuel pump replacement is not the most expensive repair in the world, but it is entirely unnecessary if you simply refuse to treat your tank like a countdown timer. Beyond the pump, a nearly empty tank risks drawing any sediment that has accumulated at the tank's bottom into the fuel system, where it can clog filters and potentially damage injectors. I kept the tank above a quarter. The pump I had at 900,000 miles was the pump the car came with. I don't think that's a coincidence. Habit number 5. The fifth habit is the one that required the most deliberate discipline because it asked me to resist an impulse that is deeply embedded in how most of us experience driving. The fifth habit is restraint with speed, not timidity, not refusing to merge, not being the vehicle that earns honesty from everyone behind you, but a genuine, principled refusal to drive faster than the situation actually required. And the physics behind why this matters are not subtle. Aerodynamic drag scales with the square of velocity. This means the difference between 60 miles per hour and 80 miles per hour is not a 33% increase in drag. It is a 78% increase. Your engine is working dramatically harder. The combustion events are happening at higher frequency. The engine runs hotter. Thermal stress on every internal component increases. Your transmission is holding gears under greater load for longer periods. Your brakes, when you eventually need them, have far more kinetic energy to absorb, which means more heat, more wear, more stress on rotors and pads and calipers. Your tires are running hotter, wearing faster, building heat that can cause structural degradation over time. Every single mechanical system in your car ages faster at high speed, and none of them age proportionally. The relationship is exponential. Going 20% faster doesn't age your car 20% faster. It ages it substantially more than that across every system simultaneously. I drove at sensible speeds. I was never the fastest car on the highway, and I was completely fine with that. On long highway stretches, I typically cruised at or slightly above the posted speed limit, rarely significantly above it. I monitored my tachometer not as a target to approach, but as a health indicator. I kept the engine in a range where it was working comfortably, not straining, not laboring. On winding roads, I drove the radius, not the limit of my nerve. And the aggregate effect of hundreds of thousands of miles driven at speeds the car was genuinely comfortable with, rather than speeds that impressed no one and cost everything, was an engine and drivetrain that simply never wore out the way hard-driven vehicles wear out. Habit number 6. The sixth habit is one where most drivers know enough to feel vaguely guilty about not doing it more consistently, but not enough to actually build the practice into their routine. Tire maintenance, all of it, complete and regular, was something I treated with the same seriousness as oil changes and the same consistency as the cold start rule. Pressure, rotation, alignment, balance. All of it, all the time, without exception. Tire pressure is the one that people understand least well in terms of its downstream consequences. Everyone knows a flat tire is bad. Most people know that underinflated tires reduce fuel economy. But the real damage from chronic underinflation is structural and progressive. An underinflated tire flexes more than it should with every revolution. That excess flexing generates heat in the tire's sidewall. That heat, accumulated over thousands of miles of underinflation, degrades the tire's structural integrity in ways that don't announce themselves visually until something breaks. It also causes the tread to wear in a specific irregular pattern, the edges wearing faster than the center. That reduces tire life significantly and can, in advanced cases, cause a tire to fail catastrophically at highway speed. I check tire pressure every week, not monthly, every single week. With a quality gauge, not the thumb press test, not the station gauge that may or may not be calibrated. A real gauge, the same one every time, so I knew its readings were consistent. And I set the pressure to the manufacturer's specification found on the door placard, not the maximum pressure stamped on the tire sidewall, which is not a target but a ceiling. 4 minutes at every weekly fill-up. That habit alone probably saved me multiple complete sets of tires over the life of the car. Rotation kept my tires wearing evenly, which extended their lives and reduced the uneven wear patterns that cause vibrations and reduce handling predictability. Alignment kept the suspension geometry where the engineers intended it to be, meaning my tires met the road at the correct angle. My steering returned to center predictably, and the subtle but continuous stress of misaligned wheels wasn't grinding through my suspension components with every mile. Balance kept each wheel and tire assembly in dynamic equilibrium, eliminating the vibrations that, if left unaddressed, migrate through the suspension and steering system and cause premature wear in every joint and bearing they pass through. Together, these 4 practices cost relatively little and returned an enormous amount in extended component life. I never had a blowout. I never had a tire failure at speed. And my suspension components lasted far longer than they would have under the stress of improperly maintained tires operating outside their designed parameters. Habit number 7. The 7th habit is the one I have heard people argue with more than any other because it forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable financial truth that most of us would rather avoid. The 7th habit is that I never deferred maintenance. Not when money was tight. Not when the schedule was inconvenient. Not when a service felt premature or unnecessary. When the manufacturer's maintenance schedule said something was due, it was done. On time, with quality parts and fluids, without negotiation with myself about whether it could wait another month. The maintenance schedule in your owner's manual exists because engineers designed it, not because manufacturers want to sell you services you don't need, not because dealers want to generate revenue. Because the people who built the engine know precisely at what point coolant degrades and begins to allow corrosion in the cooling system. They know at what point the timing belt, if your car has one, approaches the statistical end of its reliable service life. They know when transmission fluid has been through enough thermal cycles to have lost its protective properties. They designed the service intervals around these facts, and when you deviate from those intervals, you are not making a financial decision so much as you are making a bet. Sometimes the bet pays off. Sometimes the timing belt that was due at 100,000 miles makes it to 120 before it breaks. But when it breaks at 120,000 miles, it will destroy your engine in the fraction of a second it takes the pistons to swing up and meet open valves with no belt to constrain them. and the cost of not replacing that belt at 100,000 will be paid back at several hundred times the original value of the service in the form of an engine that cannot be saved. I never made that bet. Nothing was ever overdue in my car. And nothing ever failed catastrophically because of deferred service, because there was no deferred service to create the conditions for catastrophic failure. The math is completely straightforward. You either spend a predictable amount maintaining the machine on schedule, or you spend a dramatically larger and completely unpredictable amount recovering from failures that proper maintenance would have prevented. I chose the predictable amount every time, without exception, without hesitation. Habit number 8. The 8th habit operates at the level of pure physics, and it is one of those things that becomes almost automatic once you truly internalize the mechanical reality behind it. The 8th habit is smooth driving. Not slow driving, but smooth. There is a distinction that matters. Smooth driving means every input you make through the controls is gradual, measured, continuous. Throttle application, braking force, steering angle, all of it applied progressively, never aggressively, never in sudden jerks or sharp demands that force the drivetrain, the suspension, or the brakes to respond to violence instead of guidance. Consider what happens in a drivetrain under aggressive acceleration. The engine produces a surge of torque. That torque passes through the transmission, through the drive shafts, through the differential, into the axle shafts, and ultimately into the tires. Every point in that chain experiences a shock load, a sudden demand for forced transmission that the components were designed to handle, but designed to handle within reason, not as a constant diet. Every hard launch, every aggressive merge, every burst of wide-open throttle applied suddenly rather than progressively sends a shockwave through the drivetrain that accumulates in the cumulative wear of every joint, every gear mesh, every seal and bearing in the system. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of miles, and the numbers become enormous. Now, consider what smooth, progressive acceleration does to those same components. It loads them gently. It gives them time to accept the load, distribute it, manage it without shock. The wear rate is dramatically lower. The fatigue life of every component is dramatically longer. The same principles apply to braking. Smooth, progressive braking load is far gentler on rotors and pads and calipers than the repeated thermal shocks of hard stops from high speed. To steering, smooth, deliberate steering inputs are far gentler on suspension joints and steering components than sharp, jerky corrections made in reaction to situations that better forward attention would have allowed a gentler response to. Smooth driving is not just safer and more comfortable, it is one of the most mechanically effective things you can do for the long-term health of your vehicle. I learned to read traffic far ahead to anticipate the rhythm of lights and the movement of other drivers, to position my car so that I needed to react less and therefore never reacted violently. My car was always being driven by intention rather than reaction, and the components never knew anything but smooth, deliberate force application mile after mile for 900,000 miles. Habit number 9. The 9th habit is the one that required the longest investment of time to develop, but which paid dividends that I genuinely cannot fully quantify because the savings from what it prevented are invisible by definition. The 9th habit is deep knowledge of the car you drive. Not approximate knowledge. Not enough to get by knowledge. The kind of knowledge that comes from having actually read the owner's manual. The kind that comes from having a workshop service manual on your shelf that you have used. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what every fluid capacity is, every specified torque value for critical fasteners, every maintenance interval for every system, every symptom that every common failure mode produces before it becomes serious. Most people treat their cars as black boxes. Inputs go in, transportation comes out, and when something goes wrong, the black box gets handed to someone else to fix and a check gets written. I never treated my car that way. I treated it as a machine I was responsible for understanding, not a machine I could repair on my own in every case. I am not a mechanic, and there were many things I needed professional help to address, but a machine I understood well enough that I could have an informed conversation about what was wrong and what was needed. That knowledge protected me in two ways. Mechanically, it meant I noticed things early because I knew what I was looking for. Financially, it meant I could not easily be sold services I didn't need or convinced that something was wrong when it wasn't, because I knew enough to ask the right questions and evaluate the answers honestly. Over 900,000 miles across decades of service visits, the money I did not spend on unnecessary repairs and services because I knew too much to be fooled is genuinely significant. And the early interventions I made because I knew what early warning signs looked like before most drivers would have recognized them as anything at all. Those interventions are the invisible repairs, the ones that never appear on a service bill because they were addressed before they became serious, before they became expensive, before they became the kind of thing that determines whether a car survives to 300,000 miles or gives up at 150. Habit number 10. The 10th habit is perhaps the hardest to describe because it is not a procedure or a schedule or a technique. It is a disposition. It is the habit that makes all the other habits possible, the foundation that holds everything else in place over years and decades. The 10th habit is that I cared. Not about appearances, not about how the car made me look or what it said about me to other people. I cared about the machine itself, about the system, about the responsibility of owning and operating something complex and capable. I cared about it the way you care about anything you want to last, with consistency, with attention, with the willingness to do the unglamorous work of maintenance and monitoring even when it is inconvenient, even when it means spending money you'd rather spend somewhere else, even when no one is watching and no one would ever know if you skipped it. I washed the car regularly, not for aesthetics, but because washing it meant looking at every surface up close. And looking at every surface meant catching rust before it became structural, catching fluid leaks before they became serious, catching damage and wear before they became invisible under accumulated grime and neglect. I kept the interior clean and dry because moisture trapped in carpeting causes corrosion in the floor pans and substructure in ways that are invisible until they are catastrophic. I parked thoughtfully, out of direct sustained sun when possible, away from situations where minor collisions were statistically likely, away from industrial areas where chemical contaminants might settle on the paint and begin attacking the metal underneath. I kept records. I kept a logbook of every service, every repair, every fluid change, every tire rotation, every measurement I took. Not because anyone required it of me, but because the record was itself a form of care, proof to myself that what I said I would do, I had actually done. Every single decision I made about that car, from the grade of oil I put in the engine to the tire pressure I set on a cold Tuesday morning to the way I merged onto the freeway, was made with care. With the understanding that a car is not a disposable appliance, but a machine that will honor the way you treat it with the faithfulness of a mechanical law. Here is what I want you to take with you when this is over. There is nothing in any of these 10 habits that requires wealth or mechanical training or access to information that ordinary people cannot find. None of them cost extraordinary money. In fact, every single one of them is an investment that returns a multiple of what it costs in prevented failures and extended component life. What they require is attention, consistency, the willingness to form a relationship with a machine instead of simply consuming it, the willingness to do small things correctly, relentlessly, over a very long time, even when it's boring, even when it's inconvenient, even when the returns are invisible and won't be apparent until years or decades later. The automotive industry has built enormous wealth around the assumption that you won't do this, that you'll defer maintenance, run engines hard when they're cold, ignore the early warning sounds, run tanks dry, drive fast and rough and carelessly, and then accept that 150,000 miles is the natural lifespan of a car and go buy another one. That assumption is profitable for manufacturers, for dealers, for finance companies, for the entire enormous apparatus of a world built around the premise that cars are temporary. My 900,000 miles is a direct refutation of that premise. Not as a theoretical argument, but as a lived, documented, real-world demonstration that the machine can last far longer than anyone has ever told you, if you're willing to treat it with the consistency and care that genuine longevity demands. 900,000 miles. No engine replacement. No transmission rebuild. No catastrophic failure. 10 habits practiced every day, without exception, for decades. The car was capable. The question was whether I was capable of maintaining the habits that would let it demonstrate that capability over time. And I was. You can be too. Every single habit I have described tonight is learnable. Every single one is within the reach of any driver who decides to pay attention. The only thing standing between you and a car that outlasts every expectation anyone has ever had for it is the decision to start caring, and then to keep caring, 1 mile at a time, for as long as the road ahead of you is long. Start tomorrow morning. Don't drive that engine hard until it is warm. Listen on the way to work. Check the tire pressure before you leave. Look at the oil. Know your maintenance schedule and honor it without negotiation. Drive smoothly. Anticipate rather than react, and understand that every small decision you make is either adding to the life of the machine under you or subtracting from it. Make the right decisions long enough, consistently enough, and you will arrive at a number that makes strangers in gas station parking lots go quiet for a long moment before they look at you and say, "That's not possible." And you will smile, because you will know exactly how possible it is. You did it 1 careful mile at a time,